But what none of us knew was that breaking her arm was only the beginning, and their scam was about to unravel in ways they never imagined. The neighborhood had finally seen the truth, but exposing imposters was one thing. Stopping their fury would be another. The bikers had drawn a line in the sand. But the imposters weren't finished. Their revenge was coming, and it would be brutal. They had been beaten back, humiliated, yet in the dark. They began planning something far more dangerous than fists and chains. The imposters had been cornered. But desperation makes men reckless. The next time they returned, it wouldn't be vandalism, it would be war. The knock at the door when Daniel and his wife moved into their quiet neighborhood. They believed they had finally escaped the chaos of the city. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, lined with maple trees, a modest but cozy two-story with a fenced yard, a garage, and enough space for peace. They wanted a slower pace, one filled with weekend barbecues, calm evenings, and the kind of suburban normalcy that seemed almost cliché. For the first few weeks, it felt exactly like that. Daniel spent his mornings tending to the yard, while his wife decorated the interior to make it feel like home. Neighbors waved, nodded, and occasionally stopped to say hello. Nothing seemed unusual until the day 3 men appeared at their door wearing uniforms that resembled authority but carried none of its weight. They introduced themselves as members of the Homeowners Association, though Daniel had never been told his street fell under such jurisdiction. He had reviewed the deed, the paperwork, the covenants. There had been no mention of an HOA. Yet these men stood tall, clipboards in hand, their matching shirts emblazoned with a logo he didn't recognize. Their words carried the tone of command, not suggestion, as they rattled off violations and fees that made little sense. Daniel's wife, skeptical and sharp-minded, challenged them immediately. She pointed out the absence of any legal HOA documents tied to their property, asking where their authority came from. The men's confidence faltered for only a second before hardening again into arrogance. Their leader, tall and broad, stepped closer to her in an intimidating way, insisting their rules were absolute. What began as tense words escalated far too quickly. The men grew aggressive, raising their voices, accusing her of disrespect, of non-compliance. Daniel had stepped into the yard to retrieve a tool, but by the time he returned, he saw the confrontation spiraling. His wife tried to shut the door on them, but one shoved it open with such force that she stumbled backward. In the chaos, her arm was caught against the frame and twisted in a way that made a sickening crack. Her cry echoed across the street, loud enough that a few neighbors peeked through curtains, but refused to intervene. The men backed away then, muttering threats about consequences, fines, and escalating penalties. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Daniel to rush his wife to the hospital, fury boiling inside him. The doctors confirmed what he already suspected: her arm was broken, fractured cleanly at the bone. She would need a cast, weeks of recovery, and months before her strength returned fully. But more than that, she was shaken. Her sense of safety inside their own home had been shattered. Daniel sat beside her hospital bed that night, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. He had dealt with bullies before, but this was different. These men had impersonated authority, invaded his property, and injured his wife without a trace of accountability. The police report he filed was taken, but the officer's words left him uneasy. They had no record of an HOA in his neighborhood. The men were fakes, opportunists, criminals playing a role to exert control. As Daniel drove home alone that night, the weight of rage pressed heavy on his chest. He knew this couldn't be allowed to stand. He knew there had to be consequences. And as the lights of his house appeared at the end of the quiet street, another thought came unbidden. He had family who wouldn't just listen, but act. Family who lived by a different code. Family who had their own way of handling disrespect. Family who wore leather instead of uniforms. And they would not take kindly to hearing what had been done to his wife. The biker's ride-in house felt emptier with his wife resting in the hospital, her arm wrapped in plaster and her spirit bruised by the violation she had endured. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched dinner she had prepared the night before. Every creak in the walls and distant noise from the street outside carried a weight, as though the fake officers could return at any moment to press their fabricated authority again. But Daniel was not a man to sit quietly when injustice was left unanswered. The image of his wife clutching her broken arm replayed endlessly in his mind, each time sparking the same surge of fury, and in that silence, he reached for his phone and scrolled to the name he had not called in years: his cousin Mark. Mark was more than family. He was a leader, a man whose presence commanded respect in the biker circles that spanned counties. He and his brothers weren't petty thugs, but a tightly bonded crew, hardened by loyalty and guided by a simple code. No one harmed family without facing consequences. When Daniel explained what had happened, there was no hesitation. Mark didn't ask for proof, didn't demand details beyond what mattered. He simply said they would come. The following afternoon, the stillness of the cul-de-sac broke under the thunder of engines. The rumble rolled down the street like a storm as half a dozen motorcycles pulled up in a line, chrome gleaming under the sun, leather vests marked with the insignia of their club. Neighbors peeked from their blinds again, but this time their fear was not directed at Daniel. It was at the sight of men who exuded defiance and strength, men who belonged to no quiet suburb. Mark dismounted first, his boots heavy on the pavement as he embraced Daniel with a crushing grip. His eyes carried the same fury Daniel felt, sharpened into a quiet promise of retribution. The other bikers fanned out casually, scanning the neighborhood, noting every curious face watching from windows. They were not here to intimidate neighbors, but their presence was enough to remind everyone that the balance of power on this street had shifted. Daniel explained everything in detail: the uniforms, the bogus HOA claims, the threats, and the violent shove that had broken his wife's arm. Mark listened without interruption, his jaw tightening with every word. By the time Daniel finished, the men around the porch had already decided the course of action. The bikers didn't operate with paperwork or bureaucracy. Their methods were simple: find those responsible, make sure they understood the gravity of their mistake, and ensure they never dared repeat it. But Mark was deliberate. He wanted more than just revenge. He wanted to expose the fraud for what it was, to strip the imposters of their power in front of everyone they hoped to control. That night, they began their work. Daniel guided them through the neighborhood, pointing out where the men had walked, the vehicles they had arrived in, and the neighbors who seemed nervous at their presence. The bikers split into pairs, canvassing quietly, gathering whispers and rumors. Suburbs held secrets, and when asked the right way, people spoke freely. It didn't take long to discover that the fake officers had been making their rounds for months. Families had been paying fines in cash, intimidated by the uniforms and threats. Some had been coerced into signing false contracts, while others had been too afraid to resist. No one had dared to push back until Daniel died. By the end of the week, the bikers had names, addresses, and habits. The imposters weren't distant criminals, they were locals, men who had tasted power and decided to grow fat on fear. They parked their trucks to neighborhoods over, stored fake documents in a rented unit, and operated like kings in a land of the timid. Mark sat at Daniel's kitchen table that night, maps and notes spread before him. The other bikers leaned against counters and walls, their presence filling the house with a sense of security Daniel hadn't felt since moving in. When the plan was laid out, it was simple yet devastating. They would confront the imposters directly, not just to scare them, but to dismantle everything they had built, brick by brick, lie by lie. Daniel, though still simmering with rage, felt a measure of calm settle in him. For the first time since the break-in, he wasn't alone. He had allies who lived by action, not empty threats. Allies who understood that when family was harmed, there was no retreat, no negotiation, only retribution. Outside, the motorcycles gleamed under the streetlight, waiting like predators ready to strike. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but the days of living under the shadow of a fake HOA were numbered. The storm had arrived, and it wore leather and steel. The first confrontation with imposters believed they had carved out a kingdom in the quiet suburb. Their trucks rolled in during daylight hours, uniforms pressed, clipboards in hand. As they swaggered from driveway to driveway, they collected fines in envelopes, barked orders about fences and paint colors, and posted violation notices like landlords of a land they did not own. Their arrogance had grown unchecked, fed by fear and silence, but silence was about to end. On a cool evening, when the imposters made their rounds, they didn't realize they were being shadowed. Mark and two of his riders followed at a distance, engines purring low, eyes fixed on the silver pickup where the fake officers carried their props of authority. They parked a few houses down, leaning casually against their bikes, waiting for the men to finish their scam. The imposters strutted from one house to the next, laughing at how easily the residents complied. When they reached Daniel's street again, it was no longer empty. The growl of engines rose like thunder, and the bikers rolled forward in unison, surrounding the truck before the men could climb inside. Chrome glinted under the streetlights. Leather jackets reflected in the imposters' wide eyes, and Mark stood at the front, arms crossed, presence commanding. The imposters tried to maintain their charade, waving their clipboards, barking about violations and legal rights. But their voices cracked, and the false authority that once cowed neighbors crumbled under the weight of men who were not afraid. Mark didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His stare alone froze them in place. Daniel emerged from his yard, silent, his face a mask of controlled rage. His presence alone was enough to confirm why the bikers were here. Neighbors peeked from windows again, but this time they saw a different scene unfold. No one dared open their doors, but whispers spread quickly. The fake HOA had met resistance, and it wasn't the quiet type. The imposters faltered, backpedaling, insisting they had authority. But Mark's men stripped away their lies piece by piece. One yanked the clipboard from their hands and tossed it to the pavement. Another pulled open the truck door to reveal piles of blank violation slips, rubber stamps, and envelopes stuffed with cash. The truth spilled out in plain sight, evidence of fraud, intimidation, and greed. The imposters stammered, caught between the weight of exposure and the menace of men who would not let them slip away. The bikers made it clear, without a single wasted word, the game was over. They could walk away now, leave the neighborhood forever, or they could face a reckoning that would not end kindly. Terrified, the imposters scrambled back into their truck, fumbling with keys, tires squealing as they tore down the street. But their escape was nothing more than a temporary retreat. The bikers had made their point. They had shown the neighborhood that the self-proclaimed rulers were nothing but cowards. And more importantly, they had gathered enough evidence to ensure the fraud couldn't simply slink into another cul-de-sac and start over. That night, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet conversations. Curtains twitched, voices whispered, and rumors spread faster than fire. Some residents were grateful, relieved that someone had stood up to the tyranny. Others were fearful, unsettled by the presence of bikers who had taken matters into their own hands. But one thing was certain: the imposters' grip had been broken. Inside Daniel's home, the air felt lighter for the first time since the attack. His wife, still recovering, watched from the couch as the bikers sat around the kitchen table again. Mark leaned over the notes, his expression calm but focused. He wasn't satisfied with scaring them off. He wanted permanence. He wanted them dismantled completely. The imposters would return. Desperation and greed always did. And when they did, Mark and his crew would be ready. The confrontation had sent a message, but it was only the beginning. The war for the neighborhood was far from over. Escalation. The imposters did not vanish as easily as some hoped. Humiliated and exposed, they regrouped in the shadows, their pride stinging from the confrontation that had stripped away their false authority. Word of their scam had begun to spread, eroding the fear that once made residents compliant. The envelopes of cash no longer came as readily, and doors that once opened quickly now slammed shut. Their hold on the neighborhood was slipping, and desperation began to seep into their actions. For weeks, they tried smaller tricks. Anonymous threats slipped into mailboxes, fake violation letters taped to doors at night, and unmarked vehicles parked at odd hours to spook families. But none of it carried the same weight anymore. The illusion had been shattered, and the people knew now they were dealing with conmen, not enforcers. Daniel, though, understood something vital. Desperate men were dangerous. Pride wounded them deeper than any physical blow. It was only a matter of time before they returned in force, determined to reclaim what they believed had been stolen from them. Mark knew it too. His crew began making regular appearances in the neighborhood, riding in shifts, parking their bikes at Daniel's curb and walking the streets with casual confidence. Their presence was enough to reassure the residents, but it was also bait. If the imposters wanted to make a move, they would find not a quiet street of timid families, but a defended stronghold ready to bite back. And make a move they did. It began one Friday evening. The sun had just set, the streetlights buzzing faintly to life, when the roar of an unfamiliar truck echoed down the block. Not one, but two pickups rolled in. Larger than before, engines revving like beasts. The imposters had returned, and this time they weren't armed with just clipboards. Baseball bats glinted in the cab. Chains rattled from the bed. Their faces were tight with anger, their eyes wild with the need to reclaim dominance. They pulled up in front of Daniel's yard, slamming doors as they spilled out onto the street, shouting threats and curses loud enough to draw every neighbor to a window. Their intent was clear. They meant to scare, to hurt, to show that resistance would be crushed. But they had forgotten whose turf they were stepping into now. The sound came first, low and steady, the thunder of engines. From the other end of the cul-de-sac, motorcycles rolled in, headlights glaring, chrome catching the last streaks of twilight. 6 bikers, leather-clad and unflinching, pulled up in a line that cut off the imposters' retreat. Mark was at the front, his face calm, his posture steady, his very presence radiating authority. The imposters froze for a moment, realizing too late that they had walked into a trap. Their bravado wavered, but desperation drove them forward. They raised their bats, their chains, their fists, shouting louder as though noise could mask the fear creeping into their bones. The bikers didn't flinch. They dismounted with practiced ease, boots hitting pavement in perfect rhythm. Their leather vests creaked as they squared their shoulders, eyes locked on the men who dared to break into their family's world. Neighbors held their breath, the entire street suspended in silence before the storm. It didn't take long for chaos to erupt. The imposters lunged, swinging wildly, but bikers weren't strangers to fights. They moved as one, sidestepping blows, retaliating with precision. Every strike a message: you don't harm family and walk away unscathed. Chains clattered to the ground, bats splintered. Shouts turned into cries of panic as the imposters realized they had picked a war they could never win. Within minutes, the men who had once strutted around like kings were reduced to stumbling wrecks, their bravado shattered, their bodies bruised. The bikers didn't pursue when they finally broke and ran, scrambling into their trucks, engines sputtering as they fled the cul-de-sac in disgrace. The street was left in stunned silence. Neighbors who had once hidden now stepped outside cautiously, their eyes wide as they looked at Daniel, at Mark, at the bikers who had defended them when no one else dared. For the first time, the imposters' reign of fear was not only broken, it was buried. Daniel stood in his yard, his heart pounding, his hands clenched. His wife, watching from the porch, smiled faintly despite the cast on her arm. The message had been delivered loud and clear, but in Mark's eyes, Daniel saw something else, a certainty that this was not the end. Desperate men rarely accepted defeat. They would lick their wounds, plot in silence, and return with something more dangerous than fists and chains. And when they did, the bikers would be ready. The imposters thought they could storm the neighborhood with violence. Instead, they had awakened a force that thrived on loyalty, retaliation, and resolve. The battle lines had been drawn, and the war was about to escalate further. The counterattack neighborhood felt lighter after the clash. For the first time in months, families ventured outside without glancing nervously over their shoulders. Children played in yards, neighbors greeted each other warmly, and the oppressive grip of fear had loosened. Yet beneath the relief, Daniel sensed the calm was fragile. It wasn't victory. It was only a pause. The imposters hadn't been destroyed, only scattered. Pride and greed would not allow them to vanish quietly. They had tasted control and profit, and men like them did not surrender power without plotting revenge. Daniel's wife, watching the street from their porch, sensed it too. Every unfamiliar car that passed by, every shadow that lingered too long, felt like a prelude to something worse. Mark agreed. His crew didn't stop their patrols. If anything, they doubled them, ensuring that the imposters' new eyes were always on them. But Mark also knew that when cornered, rats fought dirtier. It wasn't fists or bats he feared next, it was something more calculated, more destructive. The first sign came late one night. Daniel awoke to the smell of smoke, a sharp, acrid warning that jolted him upright. Racing to the window, he saw it, flames licking at his mailbox, the wooden post crackling as fire spread along the curb. Someone had doused it in gasoline and lit it like a torch. By the time he extinguished it, the message was clear. The imposters were still here, still watching, still intent on terror. The next week, another neighbor's car was vandalized. Its tires slashed and windshield shattered. A day later, spray-painted. Threats appeared on garage doors: "Get out, pay up, you'll regret this." The imposters had abandoned the illusion of authority. They had become vandals, thugs lashing out in the dark. But Daniel knew fear was their weapon, and fear only worked if it wasn't answered. So he and Mark set their own plan in motion. The bikers began following the imposters' trail, tracing the trucks that had once prowled the neighborhood. They discovered the men were using an abandoned auto shop on the edge of town as a hideout. Its windows boarded, its lot littered with rusted scrap. Mark studied it like a general surveying enemy territory. The imposters gathered there nightly, bragging, drinking, plotting. It wasn't just about the neighborhood anymore, it was about revenge against the bikers, the people who had humiliated them in front of everyone. Daniel's wife urged caution, her arm still healing from the brutality of their first encounter. But Daniel knew waiting only gave the imposters more time to grow bold. The fight had already been brought to their doorstep. Now it was time to carry it back. The bikers moved with precision. Under cover of night, they rolled up to the shop, engines low, headlights dark. Their boots crunched against gravel as they spread out, surrounding the structure with silent efficiency. Inside, the imposters laughed loudly, the clink of bottles carrying out into the cool air. They didn't know they were surrounded. Mark gave the signal, and the bikers struck. They didn't storm blindly, they dismantled. First, they locked the trucks parked outside, chaining the axles and cutting ignition wires. Then, they flooded the shop with light, high-powered flashlights slicing through the boarded windows. The imposters scrambled, startled, their drunken bravado faltering. By the time they stumbled outside, the bikers were waiting. There was no fight this time, no swinging of bats or chains. It was control, pure and simple. The bikers laid out the truth. The imposters' reign was over, their schemes exposed, their threats worthless, and if they wanted to test it again, the consequences would be harsher than anything they could imagine. The imposters didn't laugh now. They muttered, seethed, but they backed down, retreating into the shadows. They had been cornered, their stronghold breached, their power reduced to ash. For the first time, Daniel saw true fear in their eyes, not the anger of men fighting for control, but the panic of men who realized their enemies were stronger, smarter, and unyielding. When the bikers left that night, the message had been carved deep. The imposters would either vanish for good, or they would come back with the kind of recklessness that marked the end of men who had nothing left to lose. As Daniel lay awake that night, listening to the steady breathing of his wife beside him, he wondered which path they would choose. He knew only one thing: if the imposters made the mistake of returning, it would not end in broken mailboxes or spray paint. It would end once and for all. The stage was set. The imposters had been warned. The final clash was no longer a matter of if, but when. The final reckoning. The quiet that followed the biker raid on the auto shop was deceptive. For nearly a week, the imposters disappeared. No trucks prowling the streets, no vandalized property, no threats scrawled on walls. Neighbors began to relax, even daring to believe it was over. But Daniel and Mark knew better. Men like that didn't just vanish. They stewed. They festered. They plotted. The final move came on a Saturday night, when the neighborhood was alive with the sounds of barbecues and laughter. Families gathered in backyards, children ran between houses, and for once, joy hung in the air. That was when the imposters struck. Two trucks barreled into the cul-de-sac, engines roaring, headlights blinding. Men leapt from the beds, faces masked, with bandanas, carrying crowbars, pipes, and bottles filled with gasoline. They weren't here for intimidation. They were here for destruction. The first bottle shattered against a fence, flames racing up wooden slats as neighbors screamed. Another was hurled toward a parked car, exploding into fire that licked across the hood. Chaos erupted in seconds. Parents scrambled to shield their children, dragging them indoors as the imposters unleashed their fury. But Daniel had been ready. Mark had warned him that the imposters' pride wouldn't let them fade quietly, and preparations had been made. Within minutes, the distant thunder of engines rolled closer. Mark's crew arriving in force, more bikers than ever before. The sound shook the ground as they poured into the cul-de-sac, headlights flaring like a wall of light. The imposters faltered. Their destruction paused as the bikers encircled them, cutting off escape. The air was charged with a tension that felt like the split second before lightning strikes. Daniel's wife, cast still on her arm, watched from their porch, her eyes fierce despite the pain of memory. The bikers dismounted, their presence overwhelming. Mark's voice carried across the street, calm but unyielding, a warning laced with finality. The imposters answered with desperation, swinging pipes, hurling bottles, trying to fight their way out of the trap. Flames crackled behind them, smoke curling into the night sky. And then the clash erupted. The imposters fought like cornered animals, wild and reckless, but the bikers moved with precision. Pipes were caught and twisted away, bottles knocked from hands before they could ignite. Every punch the imposters threw was met with twice the force. Every reckless lunge countered with the discipline of men who had survived battles far worse. The cul-de-sac became a storm of fists and shouts, neighbors watching wide-eyed from behind. Locked doors, but within minutes, the outcome was clear. The imposters, outnumbered and outmatched, fell one by one, their weapons stripped away, their courage crumbling. Some tried to crawl back to their trucks, only to find them already disabled, tires slashed, ignition smashed. When the last of them collapsed in the street, bloodied and broken, the silence that followed was deafening. The fire still burned against the fence, but neighbors had rushed forward with hoses and buckets, quenching the flames before they could spread. Families emerged from hiding, their faces lit with awe and relief as they looked at the bikers who had turned the tide. The imposters were rounded up, left bruised and humiliated as law enforcement, finally summoned by dozens of frantic calls, arrived. The sheriff's deputies took one look at the scene, listened to the flood of testimony from neighbors, and cuffed the imposters without hesitation. Their reign of fear ended not with quiet surrender, but with flashing lights and steel restraints. As they were loaded into cruisers, Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest. His wife stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, her eyes filled with the strength of someone who had endured and survived. The cul-de-sac, once a place of fear, was now a place of solidarity. The bikers lingered a while longer, ensuring order was restored. Their presence a reminder that family was more than blood. It was loyalty, it was protection, it was standing together when no one else would. That night, as the street quieted and the stars stretched over the neighborhood, Daniel sat on his porch and finally exhaled. The imposters were gone for good. Justice had been delivered, not by an official board or some faceless authority, but by the hands of those who refused to be bullied, those who understood that strength lay not in domination, but in unity. The war was over, the neighborhood was free, and the imposters had learned the hard way that when you break a family, you invite a reckoning you cannot escape.